our credibility is indispensable to our witness. We are making some ludicrous claims when we talk about the resurrection, when we talk about the second advent, when we talk about eternal judgment, when we talk about a God who answers prayers. We're making claims about reality. Those who are advocating these conspiracies in the Christian community are looking for solutions outside of the church, outside of Christ. It's we need to vote, we need to stop the billionaires, we need to fight China, we need to whatever. The solutions for the conspiracy, the solutions for the evil are never within the domain of Christian work. That's a huge red flag. Thanks, everybody. Like Jonathan just prayed, I am very grateful that we can be together this way. It's a privilege. I want to talk about something that's I hope very practical, but I wouldn't exactly call it doctrinal. It has more to do with how we think and how we deal with people around us and the world around us. What I want to talk about is conspiracy theories. Let me pull up my screen. I called this Confessions of a Conspiracy Theorist because this is something I know a good bit about. This is Erica and I on our honeymoon, I think. This is in 1998 when we married. We were rough kids back then, as most of you know, but there are certain things that that qualify me to be able to speak about people who hold conspiracy theories. I would start with my own credentials in this genre, with my upbringing. My father's a very respectable man in his community, in his church. He's a businessman. He's very successful. But one thing that my home had growing up was guns. I was raised around guns, and I was taught by my father that we have guns specifically so that if the government ever steps out of its bounds, that we have a way to protect and defend ourselves. That ideology stuck with me through my youth and into my own rebellious days. And then also when I was first converted in the Baptist church, I still held this this God and guns kind of mentality. And that framework sets up an autonomy from authority that can have really dangerous consequences. There's a constellation of issues that makes someone, I think, dangerous. There's a reason to separate someone who's losing touch with reality, with the borders of what's real in fantasy about conspiracies, and someone who makes it a part of their life. But that line is movable and gray. I had the potential to become a dangerous person. Well, I was, but even after I was converted in the Baptist church, in a very nationalistic movement of churches, I still had potential to be a dangerous person if I had chosen a different path. And one of the things that grips conspiracy-minded people is we'll talk about a lot of the mind frame that is involved in this kind of thinking. But one of the things that grips people stuck in these ideologies is a defense of the way of life. Like there's a conceptualization of what my life should be like, what I want my world to be like, and it's protection, like it's this home defense kind of mentality that extends, out of the borders of my home and onto my nation and onto the world. there's another checkbox that my own life was prepared for in terms of conspiracy thinking, and it was alienation. I had a high threshold and tolerance for being out of the mainstream. After high school, that wasn't true of me as a young man, but by the time I was in high school, I had been kind of hardened to the idea of trying to fit within the mainstream. And so I lived in kind of a state of alienation from in one respect or another. And I always saw myself as an outsider. And outsiders create outsider mentalities and ideologies, and those are key distinguishing marks for people who are prone to conspiracy theories. The other thing is that I think my personality was prone to look for patterns. People that look for patterns, and there's some details on this that we'll look at later, but pattern recognition. People that are prone to pattern recognition are particularly susceptible to conspiracy theories because they're seeing things that aren't there. In fact, there's one study that was done where they took participants in and they showed two different groups, two different pieces of artwork. One of them was cubist and very organized and geometric. And the other was a Jackson Pollock with no order whatsoever, just completely randomized. And they asked people to look for patterns. Well, people that were looking at geometric cubes obviously saw patterns in the paintings, but they found that the people that could make some kind of pattern out of a Jackson Pollock print were much more prone to conspiracy thinking, to believing in conspiracy theories. And so they suspect that it's something about this pattern recognition, this ability to see patterns that causes some people to be prone towards conspiracy thinking. And when I say conspiracy thinking, I ran the full gamut. I started reading conspiracy literature in high school. I was enamored early on with the Kennedy assassination. I still have a Warren Commission report on my bookshelf at home. I wasn't a casual observer of conspiracies from my youth. It was something that I took a keen interest in. I would say that in my life, I'm not claiming this is a universal pattern, but in my life, I was also a dispensationalist who read a lot of end time literature fantasy, especially like the Tim LaHaye and Jenkins Left Behind series. So this kind of like fantasy about the end of times, this apocalyptica literature was a genre that I fed a lot on. That bled over into secular dystopian literature. 1984 is a book that I know inside out, upside down. I used to read it once a year from the time I was in high school till I was a young adult. So apocalyptic literature was a fascination of mine as well. When I was a young married man, I had moved to Michigan, and Michigan was the first place where I had formalized experiences with conspiracy culture. I was waiting for my wife somewhere. I don't remember what we were doing, but I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting in my car and I was flipping through the radio dial, and there happened to be a pirate radio station in southern Michigan that was run by a Pentecostal preacher that was all conspiracy. It was an illegal radio station. They just put up an aerial on the back of their church. And I was like, what in the world have I fallen into? Like, this is crazy. I can't believe people are talking about this stuff on the radio. Turned out, it was small town, southern Michigan. So I found people that were connected to that radio station. I used to call in and talk to people. And there was a sense of legitimacy for the first time, a sense of community where other people were crazy like me. And we know how profound those experiences with community can be. And I had all those early communitarian experiences within conspiracy culture. So, so all that to say, somebody who knows me from the past would be very surprised to hear me talking on this particular subject in the negative. Why does it matter? That's the question. Especially to take up time on our citywide. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because it's so very prolific right now. It's a subject that's inundating a lot of us. We're having conversations all over the place with all kinds of conspiracy theories that are just running rampant. I don't know if there is more of that happening now, or if it's the case that we just know about it more because of media and social media. But it begs the question that we're having this citywide. Why does it matter? Well, there's at least a few reasons. Conspiracies affect behavior. It's not inconsequential. People that believe in conspiracies act differently. It does motivate the things that they do and don't do. Whether you get vaccines, whether you wear a mask, whether you have any concern for environmental causes, all of these are behaviors that are directly affected by belief in conspiracy. Those behaviors can be problematic. They can be difficult for several reasons, which we'll look at. So it matters because it affects behavior. It matters because it's very prevalent. The most recent numbers I could find said somewhere between 50 and 60% of Americans believe in at least one conspiracy. And a predisposer to believing in conspiracies is believing in one or more conspiracies. So they're contributing factors. So we have 1 out of 2 adults, as far as we can tell, that believe in some form of conspiracy theory. So what about that? Well, we don't think that 50% of people are crazy. And I hope that by the time you listen to all this, you don't think that I am proposing that if you believe conspiracy theories, you have some kind of mental disorder. I don't think that's the case. But there's this incredible prevalence, and we should talk about. I think it behooves us to talk about that there are real conspiracies. Watergate was a real conspiracy. The Gulf of Tonkin was a real conspiracy. MK Ultra by the intelligence community was a real conspiracy. There are real conspiracies. A conspiracy can be loosely defined as the belief, the speculative belief in a powerful group of people doing something bad. That's a working definition of conspiracy. The problem we run up to, and my difficulty in preparing and delivering this message, is that there is something conspiratorial about the Bible. There's an our eschatological beliefs preclude us to considering conspiracy. In whatever view you take, Bible-believing Christians believe that there's going to arise some kind of organized conspiracy against the Church of Jesus in the last days, and that conspiracy is going to be stopped by the second advent. So that's commonly held by most Bible-believing people. Where do we separate a belief system like that from a COVID hoax, or from flat eartherism, or from whatever else, reptilian people? And why should it matter? That's what we'll talk about more. Another reason that it matters is because conspiracies affect our witness. Sorry, I skipped ahead there. I think they do affect our witness. How believable we are when we say things like we believe in the resurrection or we believe in the second coming can be affected by what we believe about other things. So those are reasons why I want to approach this. My agenda, very clearly, I want to state it up front. I don't want people's lives hurt because of wrong ideologies. I'm gonna. I have 2 very close friends in the last few years who I've watched their lives deteriorate because of strongly held convictions about conspiracies. In the one case, a man that I cared very much for spun out, lost grip with reality, and ended up in a very, very destructive cycle that took his life ultimately. And another very close friend that I care very, very much for ended up alienating himself from fellowship and loving connections over firmly held convictions about conspiracies. And it's tragic. It's really, really tragic to watch. I struggle sometimes. I get frustrated sometimes, especially in the social media environment, watching people fall down these rabbit holes, because there's something. I'm offering this as a warning to someone who's walked down this path. There's something about these ideologies that have a gravity of their own. And you can orbit around them at a safe distance and be curious about certain things, but if you get close enough, these things pull you in, and they really have a gravity of their own, and some people never come out the other side. It becomes it becomes an all-encompassing ideology. It becomes a worldview. It becomes everything. And it shuts down other functional parts of your life, and it really can be quite dangerous. It can lead to mental health problems. It can exacerbate mental health problems. There's a real danger in some of these ideologies. The other thing is that I really don't want Jesus's reputation marred by our foolishness, by a bad witness. I want to read right here, and if you have a moment, or if you want to pull up your phone, 2 Timothy 2:23. 2 Timothy says, "Now flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. But refuse foolish and ignorant speculations, knowing that they produce quarrels. The Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged, with gentleness correcting those who are in opposition, if perhaps God may grant them repentance." Now, I don't know how many of you have people that you're close to that are deep into conspiracies. But if you do, if you know people who travel in these circles, in these ideologies, who are heavily invested in these ways of thinking, just ask yourself if that's the description that you would use for them. That they're, let me read it again. "Flee from youthful lusts and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart, but refuse foolish and ignorant speculations, knowing that they produce quarrels." I've never been around many things more quarrelsome than conspiracy thinking. It is all about the quarrel. When it comes to our witness, I think that conspiracy theories can affect our witness in at least two ways. The first has to do with the end times. And what happens is that there's kind of a cycle that gets set up. We consider ourselves God's people, on God's side, and the true and right ones. And we apply that not just to the gospel, not just to the things that are specifically enumerated for us, but to whatever our personal views happen to be about some especially cosmic evil or good. If you think that Satan is keeping Trump out of the White House and stole the election, or that some cabal run by Bill Gates has invented COVID and is causing sickness across the world, then you set up this paradigm where you're good and this thing is evil. That becomes its own justification and rationale for all of your thoughts. And then when you experience hardship for having those ideas, whether it's ostracization from your social circles, or, in the case of COVID conspiracies, the need to wear a mask in public, and you feel a sense of persecution about that, or a perfect example is meeting regulations, restricting the size of meetings. I've had several people talk to me in private and in public about whether or not I think the church should yield to government regulations about meeting size. And I answer, yes, of course I do. And they say, well, isn't that persecution? Should we forsake the assembling of ourselves together? And I say, well, it's not persecution. And you're thinking far too much of yourself. It's not the church that's being singled out for this. It's a public health concern. That's a different rationale than persecution. We're not being persecuted. All people in all places are being restricted in their meeting size. And so we need to find creative solutions for that. The other problem with these ideologies is that they cause us to miss potential blessings or how God's working in our life. I happen to think that these meeting restrictions that are happening across America because of COVID are an incredible opportunity to reconfigure what it means to do church, to get out of the mega church model and to reorient the assembly of the saints back in small intimate groups of people. It's an incredible opportunity if you look at it the right way. But it's almost humorous that from one perspective this is persecution, and from the other perspective it's a blessing. So this all gets cast in the frame of good and evil, God and Satan. And this justification cycle works back and forth, so that when I face any kind of obstacle to this ideology and thinking, well, that's persecution because I'm right, because I'm on God's side. So I re-entrench my whole ideology. It just, every time I push up against difficulty with either some regulation, some restriction, some ostracization, some counter argument, I re-entrench my thoughts because I'm of course being persecuted because I'm on God's side. And this has a way of making an idol of a conspiracy. When you connect your view of whether it's the flat earth or a COVID conspiracy or election conspiracy or whatever the case, whichever conspiracy we want to analyze, when you connect that to good and evil, right and wrong, then you've automatically made an idol of that ideology, because anyone who doesn't see it or doesn't agree with it or pushes back against it becomes the enemy of God, because you're fighting for truth and justice. So this cycle is a really vicious cycle for people that practice conspiracy thinking. The other thing is that it becomes, because of that process, and maybe even on its own, it tends to be the case that people who believe strongly in conspiracy theories, it becomes all encompassing. It becomes this distraction, and it creates confusion around all their conversations. It becomes at the center because it's connected to God and Satan, good and evil, light and dark. It becomes a central thesis around which people articulate right and wrong. And so it becomes the litmus, the tell-all for how you know who's on whose side. And so my conspiracy, my connection to the right, the true, the righteous view, the hidden view, it becomes connected to everything else I know about God. And so whoever pushes against that is pushing against my ideology of God. When we talk about motivations, let's wait and we'll talk about motivations a little more. Let's talk about what makes a conspiracy theorist. What's in those thought patterns. One is the propensity to see patterns. We've already talked about this, but the technical name for it is the illusory pattern perception. If you want to look it up, if you want to look up some some research or paperwork on this principle. It's this pattern perception, this Jackson Pollock, I see whatever I see. That ability to see things that aren't there. Now, that ability to see things that aren't there is obviously an important part of human cognition. I mean, what we're all looking at right now and reading are just lines, they're just shapes. The ability to turn those dark spots from light spots into letters and connect letters to sounds is a pattern perception. We use pattern perception all the time. It's a vital part of our consciousness. But with some people that is hyper emphasized. It's an attribute that they have that they do in an extreme capacity, and people that do that in extreme capacity are prone to these kinds of thinking. Now, we can understand why God made us with these things, not just to decipher reading and writing, but the incentive structure of the world is built around it. If I'm walking through the woods and I see something next to my foot, if I assume that's a snake and it's really a stick, I haven't lost anything. But if I see it, and especially if it moves when I'm walking, and I assume it's a stick and it's really a snake, I get bit. So the incentive of our thought patterns is to see the pattern, is to see the thing, not to see the not thing. So this is built into the whole framework of why conspiracy thinking happens. So when you're dealing with people who are caught in these ways of thinking, be looking for these patterns. Look for the pattern that they're seeing, because sometimes if you want to help somebody back up a little bit from one of these things and try to find another path to walk in ideology, if you can help them see the pattern they're looking for and how they're creating the pattern more than exposing the pattern, it can help slow somebody's thinking in this way. Another motivation for conspiracy thinking is the need for simple solutions to complex problems. And I feel like it's a problem that to talk about these motivations, it's hard to talk about these motivations without feeling like you're talking down to people that hold these ideologies. I don't. I understand very well why this is a propensity. It goes along with this next one, the proportionality fallacy, that when big things happen, we think there are big reasons why it happened. It's hard for us to take in the idea that a bunch of small things, small disconnected things especially, can produce these huge effects, not just in the world, but in my own life. When I'm affected by something, I want to understand what's at the source. What's causing me this problem? Why am I having this difficulty? Why am I experiencing this? I want to find what the problem is so I can get at it. And that need often pushes us towards the simplest solution possible. And so when we look at these vastly complex issues, economic issues, political issues, foreign diplomacy issues, you talk about war, terrorism, these vastly complex issues, we tend towards simplistic, reductionist thinking about these things. And we always have to be suspicious of that propensity. What we need to learn to do is look for complex reasons for complex problems. That it can be many, many things that we can and can't perceive that can produce one big effect in our life. I think the COVID conspiracies regarding manufactured virus, whether it's from some Chinese conspiracy to destroy America or some elitist cabal to destroy people, whoever the they is behind them, the reason for that is that the idea of these oft repeated mutations of a virus that finally jump into a human aren't palatable to the intellect. It doesn't seem like something that would happen. but those mutations are exactly how these viruses come to be. So, so the simpler solution for if you don't take time to work through that, the simpler solution is that somebody's doing this to us. Well, who is doing that? Well, whoever would do that is horrible. So who do I think now your worldview kicks in? Who's my bad guy? Who do I think is the really danger? Who's the snake? That's what it comes down to. So then this other motive is to reassert control. I can't do anything about viruses mutating. Nothing. I mean, literally, there's nothing I can do about mutating viruses. Can't affect it one iota. No matter what I do, there's nothing I can do about a virus mutating. But I can bring awareness to the cabal that's trying to destroy our freedoms. I can refuse to consent to going along with the evil manipulators of humankind. I can, strap up with my guns and go stand outside the State House. I can threaten to fight back against people that I think are trying to control me. I can do something about those things, at least intellectually. I think that I can. And so that's why we end up thinking this way about these things. When I was making notes about this, this is this is my note page that I came up with. When you're thinking about where does conspiracy come from and what is it doing, it's doing two main things. If you follow this chart to the top, it's concretizing. It's making things concrete. It's making something solid. So there's a bunch of little pieces that are bothering me, and I collect it all into one hard thing so that I can get my mind around it. That's making it concrete, and that's an attempt for meaning. I'm trying to find meaning out of something that doesn't make sense to me. The other main motivation is control. I want to reassert control in my life. I want something that I can do, something that I can be involved with, some way to react that makes sense to me. And the response of that need to control is to simplify. I need, if I'm going to control this, it needs to be something that I can understand. It needs to be bite-sized. It needs to have a person that I can point to that's responsible, something like that. It is really important, I think, that we don't make caricatures of people who hold these ideologies. The idiot in his mother's basement with a tinfoil hat on is not a meaningful way to think of this. There are many very intelligent people who succumb to these thought patterns. I really don't think it's a function of intelligence. Now, as you can see here on my notes, the second one from the bottom, it's not a measure of intelligence, but it can be associated with low levels of education. And it's not necessarily because of the education, but because people with high levels of education usually feel more empowered about making changes in the world around them. And so it's directly tied to the ability to act and function in the world. Whoops. So look through these notes on the side with me. When we think about, one more thing before we move on. In this handwritten note here, there's a few features that make conspiracies very difficult to combat. And a well-designed conspiracy has these features. They're in green here on the note. A well-designed conspiracy, one that's hard to combat, is speculative. Like we see this all the time in the social media world. I haven't checked this out, but it's interesting. They're just speculative. It's just, I think this could be so, and that's enough to go off of. Well, you can't really combat speculation because something could or could not be. So oftentimes conspiracies are framed in this speculative format. They're also tend to be contrarian. So they're anti-authority, anti-establishment. This has to do with worldview. It has to do with who you think is trying to control you or who you think the bad guy is. So it's me, the little guy, against the big power structure. So they have this contrarian approach. They're esoteric. Um, People that study conspiracy theories in psychology often attribute it to what they sometimes call magical thinking. So supernatural, things outside of the physical realm. People that believe in other things that are outside the natural realm are prone to conspiracy theories because they think there are powers that move things. Well, guilty. I think there are powers in the world. I think there are supernatural things. So that means I have to be extra cautious in evaluating things, that I'm not being subject to a bias. A well-designed conspiracy is amateurish, and I don't mean unsophisticated. I mean not pertaining to expertise in a given field. On the rare occasion where you find someone who has some expertise advocating a conspiracy, that person will be in contradiction to their accepted field. So someone that studied physics that makes a flat earth video will find himself standing against the rest of the physics community. A nurse practitioner who has an anti-COVID conspiracy video is standing in opposition to the entire medical community by and large. The amateurish quality of a well-ordered conspiracy leaves plenty of room for the Dunning-Kruger effect, which we'll talk about again. And the conspiracy of self-sealing. In other words, any attempt to prove it is a proof of it. It's circular in its reasoning. So if I'm talking to somebody who believes in the flat earth and he says, well, if somebody would just take a picture of the globe earth, then I could be convinced. And so then you show them a picture of the globe earth and they say, well, see, that just proves the conspiracy because that's a manufactured picture. There's no way out of the circle. Any proof that's offered as evidence becomes evidence not against the conspiracy, but in favor of it. That's the beautiful thing about conspiracies. There's a fantastic passage in the beginning, in the introduction to Orthodoxy by G.K. Chesterton, where he describes a man who's insane. And he says the insane person, I'm paraphrasing, but he says the insane person is not insane because he cannot practice logic. He's insane because he cannot practice anything but logic. And then he gives some examples. He gives an example of a man who thinks himself the king of England and all men are conspiring against him. And anything you would do to tell him that you're not conspiring against him is exactly what you would do if you were conspiring against him. And so he's stuck in a ring. He's stuck in a circle. He can't ever get off of the track. It just goes in a circle around and around and around and around again. That's self-sealing. There's no way out of it. So here's the beginning of my critique. Often, while especially in our day, right now, the current contemporary conspiracies that are popular right now are often being foisted as Christian conspiracies. They're predominant among people who are calling themselves Christians. And my critique of that is that those who are advocating these conspiracies in the Christian community are looking for solutions outside of the church, outside of Christ. We need to vote, we need to stop the billionaires, we need to fight China, we need to whatever. The solutions for the conspiracy, the solutions for the evil are never within the domain of Christian work. That's a huge red flag. There's an assumption that that we know more than we do. The way I put it here is that we're smarter than our ancestors, but we're still not very smart. There are just some things that the human intellect is not good at. We get by with a lot of things because of collective intelligence and technology and the wisdom of the past we're building on. So we really are way ahead of our own intellects because of all of these things. But if you're not familiar with Dunning-Kruger, I would really encourage you to familiarize yourself with the Dunning-Kruger effect. What it says is there's a peak and then a dip and then comes back up. It's a graphic representation. And what the Dunning-Kruger effect says is that there's an inverse relationship between how much someone thinks they know about something and how much they are actually knowledgeable about a given thing. It's often called the what's that show? The show with the judges, X Factor, something like that. This singing contest. It became popularized during the time of these reality show singing contests because people would go on there and think that they were fantastic singers and they were horrible, and it became suspicious. Like, why do so many people think that they're so good and they're really so very, very bad? And it's this effect. Expertise takes a long time to develop in any given field, and expertise brings with it not only expertise about the things that you know, but a knowledge of how vast the field is and all of the things that you don't know. And so there's a humbling effect to real study in any given field. And this is borne out by people who have not studied a field, think that things are much more simple than they are. So they claim credibility or access to understanding things that are way out of their league. This happens all the time with statistical analysis, with mathematics, with epidemiology right now, with biology. I mean, I have a few social media groups that I follow that just post the crazy stuff that's circulating, and it seems insane. Like some of the things that people think. Who remembers when 5G was causing COVID? Like, I don't even know how you get there, but people assert these things about radio frequencies and about what it does to the cellular structure, and they have no idea what they're talking about. They're just making assertions. They feel very smart. They're using big words. They're using something borrowed from another field that they do know about, or whatever the case may be. But this Dunning-Kruger effect runs rampant through all these ideologies. Confirmation bias is the same thing. When you already believe something, the evidence that you collect confirms what you already believe. It's very hard to fight against confirmation bias, and I would encourage you all to try as best you can to negate your internal bent towards confirmation bias. We all are doing it. We're all confirming the things that we already believe, and we need to put purposeful thought experiments, thought exercises in place to try to disconfirm some of our thoughts. If you don't do that from time to time, if you're not trying to challenge your thought process, you're not practicing good, what I call mental hygiene. You should be challenging your biases. You should be trying to think around them. You should be trying to acknowledge them where they are and be careful of them. You need to be able to assimilate new evidence and change your mind about things when you're wrong. That's humility. This is really a deeply spiritual, biblical principle. And the way it's summed up in the Bible is that a wise man loves instruction. Wisdom can change its mind. Wisdom wants to be found wrong where it's wrong, but the fool wants to keep rushing on. There's many, many passages in the Proverbs about this. The fool just wants to keep believing what he already believes. He wants to continue running in the direction he's running. He doesn't want to consider an alternate path. But wisdom loves correction. Wisdom loves rebuke. Wisdom loves instruction. Wisdom wants to find out where it's wrong and correct itself. And those are patterns, brothers and sisters, that we need to entrench, not just in our intellectual life, but in our spiritual life, where we cultivate this love of finding our error, that it's like a treasure hunt, like it's one less error. It's digging out these stones, these things that get in the way of a fruitful, productive life. All right, and lastly here, I want to talk about, just checking the time. Lastly here, I want to talk about the role of the internet and our personal algorithms. I don't want to belabor the point. There's a lot of conversation happening about that now. I hope that you're aware of this issue. When we're on the internet, some people have referred to it as our own Truman Show. It's a pop culture reference that maybe not everybody will get, but there's an individualized world for you online. When you, in your social media, in your YouTube list, in your Google search results, those things are all tailored for you. And those algorithms are feeding you things for specific purposes. And they don't always have, in fact, maybe they almost never have your best interests at heart. There's lots of information about how this works and why. Surveillance capitalism is kind of a buzzword for it right now. If you're not familiar with that idea that you're being fed stuff online that keeps you at the screen, then reach out to me and I'll help you find some more information about that, because it's a big issue. So what happens is, here's how a lot of conspiracy theorists are made. They happen to be on YouTube and see some provocative title of a video. Science proves the earth is flat, or you can't believe what NASA is covering up, or things Bill Gates doesn't want you to know, some kind of clickbaity title. And this person sits there and it's maybe packaged in an interesting way, and more for just giggles, he follows that rabbit. Well, that's interesting. I never heard anybody talk about that. Not seriously, anyhow. Wonder what else they have to say. Then the next thing that's happened is somebody sat through 3 hours worth of flat Earth videos, and now your algorithm is geared that the way to keep you around is to put flat Earth information in front of you. So anytime you're looking for something, it's going to put that in front of you. That's a very simplistic way of explaining this process, but it's just like it's like a digital version of confirmation bias. It keeps putting the things that it thinks you want to see or that you already are invested in, and it's very hard to disconfirm. So that's a feature of this whole thing and how a lot of people end up in this track. How do we help? I've been talking to people for a while about how to help with this. I've been soliciting input from other people. I've been asking, have people that I know, have you ever converted a conspiracy theorist? Quite frankly, I think about my own life, like what changed in me that caused me to think outside of that track. And I don't know. It's very difficult. It's certainly well nigh impossible online. I'll just tell you that. I don't know that there's a whole lot that can be done. What I do know is that you're not going to fight somebody out of these ideologies or prove them out of them. If somebody's entrenched in a conspiracy ideology, you're not going, because of all those features that I've already talked about, you're probably not likely going to be able to prove them out of it. It doesn't matter how much time you spend. That's kind of a pessimistic approach. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have conversations with people and try to add information and try to, throw up some warning signs when people are going down these paths. But a direct head-on approach is least likely to yield results. What I think is much more likely to be profitable for people that are stuck in these ideologies is to try to find a common set of values and goals. Like why are they? What's at the bottom of this? What's their motivation? Why is what seems so insensible sensible to them? There's some reason why they're following this track. There's something that they're getting out of it by way of motivation. They're asserting control in their life, or they're simplifying things, or they're making sense of a complex world. There's something about, or they're just using this as leverage for their ideology. Like I hate whatever, so that's my bad guy, and I make it the enemy of these conspiracies. But figure out what those motives are. One of the most compelling things, I think, if you can have an honest conversation with somebody who has conspiratorial ideologies, is to talk about the role of fear in their life. Fear has torment. Fear is miserable. It is not fun to be afraid of things. I don't I don't think you have to convince anybody of that. But sometimes you have to show people that they're operating from a perspective of fear. And 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 that fear is not necessary. Like um let's take masks for instance. I'm afraid that that's the government controlling us and they're going to remove all of our liberties. Well, okay, I could address that from the logic of that premise, which has some really bad problems. But I it might be more profitable to take that person and say, why are you so afraid of this? Like, why is that the fear that captivates you? What do you think about your rights? Like, how is this the central motive in this situation for you? And try to untangle their thoughts and feelings around fear. Why are you so afraid? That can be productive. I think it can be helpful, especially with people that you're close to talk about this thought experiment of what could potentially prove you wrong. Like, can we just imagine, let's take your theory. Can we imagine what would be the pieces that would show it to be wrong? How could we find something that would disprove the idea? Where could we look for, or what kind of content would make this not what you think it is? And then go on a search for those things, like to really explore disprovability. Somebody has to want to be honest to get to that place. So it's a hard step to get over sometimes. It can be helpful to explore biases and personal frailty. In I said in specific there, but I didn't finish it. This confirmation bias is a huge one. Dunning-Kruger effect is a huge one. Proportionality. These biases that we have kicking around in our minds and solving all the problems. Well, intellectually, the world's a problem. Like we've got to provide for our families. We've got to avoid crashing our cars. We've got to eat. We've got to all kinds of things that we have to do. Our minds are constantly trying to figure that out. They're constantly solving problems. And these things that we call biases are shortcuts to finding those solutions. That's why they're there. They're not actually necessarily bad things. These ways that we think, they're there for a reason. They are shorthand. They're a way to make quick solutions to difficult problems. Somebody's writing on my screen. I don't know how that's happening. So I think if we can approach bias from a perspective of understanding what its utility is, instead of trying to make people feel dumb for having biases. Like, I don't think that we should be ashamed of having biases. The problem is when they're in effect and when they're in control and we don't know they're there. And I think that's another definition of conspiracy thinking. When biases are in control and you don't know that they are. So that's what's to be avoided. And to talk about the legitimate use of bias, why we have the prejudices that we do, why we have confirmation bias, why we practice proportionality, all these things have legitimate functions in our normal life. And let's just put them in their proper place, and maybe that's a way to help. Also, identity is a huge issue when you're talking about, it's why these conspiracies run in kind of wagons together. The COVID conspiracy, the politicization of mask wearing, and the election conspiracies. Like, if you tell me somebody has one of those, I could probably set up some some proportional guesses of how much they have the others, because there's an identity connected with those ideologies. There's a kind of person that thinks a kind of way that's associated to those particular thoughts. What we're finding, and I think what's been distressing to me in the last year, is that some people who we thought, for all kinds of reasons, were like, take for instance, how many plain people voted in Lancaster County in this last election and in the one previous. Like the last two Trump elections turned out more plain people to vote than, I don't know, I don't have anything metric, but a lot of people voted for the first time in their lives for Donald Trump. And so there's a confusing identity there for me. I presumed that these people's identity, in a large group of people, their identity was one thing, and their actions proved their identity was much more aligned with something else. Now, they don't see that, many of them don't see that conflict, but I would want to get to the bottom of that identity. What's connected? What of you is connected to this idea that's causing you to have these thought patterns? And then really laying out agenda. Like, what's your agenda? What are you trying to accomplish in the world? Like, Trump being president, that's your agenda. That's why you're down this rabbit hole. That's what your life is about. If you can deconstruct the agenda and show the agenda to be problematic, maybe we have a chance of backing somebody out of the ideology that's supporting the agenda. So those are some how-tos if you find yourselves in conversations with people about these kinds of matters. This is my last slide here, and I've used my time. It's my closing thoughts about this issue of conspiracy thinking. Our credibility is indispensable to our witness. We are making some ludicrous claims when we talk about the resurrection, when we talk about the second advent, when we talk about eternal judgment, when we talk about a God who answers prayers. We're making claims about reality. And if those claims are tainted with a bunch of falsifiable, unbelievable things, all of us see the absurdity of telling people that a fat man comes down their chimney and leaves gifts for the children on December 25th, and then a fairy comes and takes your teeth and gives you money, and then a giant Easter bunny comes around and leaves candy on Easter, and we don't see that could lead children to disbelieving their parents when they talk about God. Like, that seems like a reasonable conclusion, that if you're going to lie to your children in all those ways, that you may have some problems getting them to believe you about other things. Well, it's the same with our Christian witness. If we're going to make claims about God, claims about prayer, claims about the resurrection, claims about eternal life, claims about the second advent, and we're also making claims that people think are falsifiable, silly, ridiculous, or foolish, we're really damaging our real number one purpose, to bring people into the kingdom of God. And I don't think that we can separate that from this conversation. I think that our lives need to not cause offense in our land. The whole reason that Jesus sends Peter to pay the tribute money is that they wouldn't take offense. It's not out of obligation. It's not out of duty. It's so that the people around them will give them space to do the work that Jesus is there to do for the kingdom of God. And we have to have our priorities right. Flexing our rights and getting our way and causing a ruckus about things that are they're not our calling and they're not our business. They're just making us a problem for our nation. This is not well. This is not well for the kingdom of God. We need to learn how to yield and be submitted citizens in places that don't violate the law of God. And if that's too much for people, then the conversation shouldn't be about the conspiracy. It should be about rebellion against God's authority. We need to focus on the word and the gospel and eternal things, the passage from 2 Timothy that we read there. We need to keep our eyes on eternity and on God being our help. I want to read this passage. It's a little bit longer. And I always feel a little bit funny doing this because it's very much out of context. This passage in Isaiah was not written about the conspiracy theories we're talking about. But it is interesting, the premise. I'll share the premise by the time we're done. But in Isaiah chapter 8 and starting in verse 9, there's this curse that comes from the prophet. He says, "Be broken, O peoples, and be shattered, and give ear, all remote places of the earth. Gird yourselves, yet be shattered. Gird yourselves, yet be shattered. Devise a plan, but it will be thwarted. State a proposal, but it will not stand, for God is with us. For thus the Lord spoke to me with mighty power and instructed me not to walk in the way of this people, saying, you are not to say it is a conspiracy in regard to all that this people call a conspiracy, and you are not to fear what they fear or be in dread of it. It is the Lord of hosts whom you should regard as holy, and he shall be your fear, and he shall be your dread. Then he shall become a sanctuary, but to both the houses of Israel, a stone to strike and a rock to stumble over, and a snare and a trap for the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Many will stumble over them. Then they will fall and be broken. They will even be snared and caught. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples, and I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob. I will even look eagerly for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts who dwells on Mount Zion. When they say to you, consult the mediums and the spiritists who whisper and mutter, should not a people consult their God? Should they consult the dead on behalf of the living? To the law and to the testimony. If they do not speak according to this word, it is because they have no dawn. They will pass through the land, hard pressed and famished, and it will turn out that when they are hungry, they will be enraged and curse their king and their God as they face upward. Then they will look to the earth and behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be driven away into darkness. The reason I read that passage is not because it has the word conspiracy in it. It's confederacy in King James. It's because there's a principle, and I think this would be my last resort in trying to talk a brother back from the edge of this conspiracy ideology. Our confidence, our hope, our trust is supposed to be in God. Like, there's so many lessons throughout the whole Old Testament. We don't have to figure out the world's schemes. We don't have to uncover the works of darkness. Here's what we have to do. We have to be faithful. We have to trust in God. That's our job. And if I couldn't get to the end of logic and reason and motivation and psychology, my last appeal would be, can we just focus on what we're here for? Can we just trust in God? Can we just let him be the revealer of the darkness? Can we let him be the avenger of righteousness? Can we let him do his job and we'll do ours? And ours is not to be caught up in these things. Ours is to be loving our neighbors, serving the poor, preaching the gospel, caring for our families and the people around us. That's our job. That's as close to a sermon as you're going to get out of this one, I think. Lastly, second to last, we need to avoid rumors. These are all biblical things that we should avoid. Rumors, gossip, evil imaginations, and vain speculations. And there is so much of that that goes on in this community of thought. Exactly those things. Rumors, lies, gossips, evil imaginations, and vain speculations. And so much of what conspiracy thinking is built out of relies on those exact things. And those are things that our minds are not supposed to be fixed on, and we are certainly not to be repeating and propagating. That is not what we're growing in the kingdom. Lastly, the very last thing, we need to shun false prophets. These people that make predictions and prognostications, that make dramatic claims about what's going to happen and it never comes to pass, that needs to be marked when we know of it and pointed out, and those people need to lose any trust that they have among our kinds of people. Like we need to let people know when someone has a track record of unrepentant false prophecies, they're not to be listened to. Like how many times have I heard somebody say something ridiculous and make some wild accusation? Certainly with I hope that none of you have had too much interaction with the QAnon community, but it's out there, all these kinds of predictions and prognostications, and they're being done by and large by people who are professing to be Christians. It never comes to pass, and they just keep going. Kenneth, the TV preachers, we got plenty of accusations against them, but the same kind of thing. Kenneth Copeland, all these TV preachers making all these predictions, and it's just more evidence of their false ways. So I hope that that's helpful. I hope that if there's some tactics here that we've discussed, or at least that help you understand why people around you may be caught up with these kinds of thought patterns, and what things we can do to try to help. So thanks for listening.